Here we are. So, welcome again. First of all, I'm so happy to have shared with you this preview, this little trailer of a movie that Tim Walker has produced in collaboration with WBBC and Vionnet, and that is taken in competition for shorts at the Venice Film Festival. That's why we could not show the entire movie. So this was just a very special preview just for you here in Istanbul. I'm very, very pleased to have Tim Walker with me to talk about really photography and crossing boundaries between different genres because his pictures are never just pictures. They're never just about what you see, but they make you think. They make you travel in time, in space. That is the beauty of Tim's work. Many of you are maybe familiar with his work from the pages of W, sure, but even Vogue and many other magazines. Tim has received many awards all over the world, in particular from the International Center of Photography in New York, from the British Council. He has helped me to win many awards from the Association of Magazine in the United States for W. And I want to bring here, like, to repeat something that was very inspiring this morning when Abel Ferrara said that the language of images doesn't need words. As you can see with this movie, Tim can also have words, but really he's primarily a storyteller that uses images to tell his dreams. So with Tim, we will talk about dream and reality, the reality of actually making these pictures, and the dream of imagining these pictures. So, Tim, where are your inspiration come from? I mean, it all starts in your head. I know this. He's all it all. I mean, our collaborations always starts with a phone call or an email or a message or something that says, "I was thinking Myanmar, and I was thinking about this girl, and I was thinking about an acid trip, and there you go, and we have a story." This story in particular had a very long gestation. Somehow it was a story that was published in last year December issue of W, because also immediately Tim talked about it as more than just a photographic portfolio. But let's go to the really the roots of all of this. What do you dream?
God,
How do you dream?
what do I dream? God, many different things. Like everyone in the audience, I'm sure everyone dreams a lot. But I think that the clip of the film that you've just seen, that was an adventure for me because I've been a photographer for 15 or 20 years, and to take the step into making a moving piece is a new adventure. So you've got to be gentle with what you've seen because it's very fragile, and I'm quite sensitive about it. But the whole idea of the film you've just seen, the clip, the trailer, came from Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tale, The Little Mermaid, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with. So that's a dream of mine. I've always been fascinated by the mermaid. Why I'm fascinated by the mermaid, I have no idea. Maybe someone in the audience will know that. Must have some meaning, I don't know. But yeah, I'd read The Little Mermaid a long time ago, and then I reread it because a friend of mine was pointing out to me how dark the story is. And I was fascinated how I've perceived it as quite a sweet story. So I reread it, and sure enough, it is a very dark story. And then I thought, well, would that be such a great idea for a series of stills? So then I approached Stefano about realizing that as a story. I call it a story. It's actually a set of fashion photographs of sorts. Yeah, and that's where that came from. And then when we were doing the stills that you can see behind you, projected, I decided to do some Super 8 footage because for me, the movement and the grace that the model Kristen had was way more interesting than I could achieve as the still. So when I was looking at the Polaroids, I'd lost the magic. So I started to film the Super 8, and then we got the footage back, and it blew me away. It was sort of like someone opening the door, and I could see a whole pathway ahead of me of movement, and somehow everything I'd done as in a still, somehow it was such a breath of fresh air for me. So we wrote a story based on the Super 8 footage, and that's the trailer you've seen. So that's a very long, roundabout way of explaining where dreams come from, maybe.
Well, this is like, I mean, maybe I can say something about Tim. I met him like 20 years ago. I think he came for some kind of show in his book. I was working for L'Uomo Vogue, for Italian Vogue at the time, and he came to 11 Cadogan Gardens. That was this kind of hotel where you would have tea at 5. And so he showed up with his like rain boots and his the hole in the Shetland sweaters and the raincoat and a big book full of drawings. So I want to tell this story because really what I was looking at was a book of drawings that was a book of ideas, of dreams that he wants to make real. I always thought as an editor-in-chief or as a fashion director, whatever position I cover in my life, that my goal is to make other people's dreams come true. Somehow that's what I think magazines should do with their writers, with their photographers, with the people they collaborate with. And I have pursued Tim for many years, trying to convince him to work at the different magazine. I was at the time considering the New York Times and Esquire, and he always was too busy to make his dream happen with somebody else. Finally, I mean, when I was at W, I think we started this collaboration with like a fantastic portfolio of kids on the East End of London, where Tim lives. And actually, again, was his idea. He's an originator of ideas. Somehow, I think many people think that when you put together a magazine, you have all the ideas and you just need executors. Actually, you are a collector of ideas. You are like the person that is listening, not always the person that is like, I would say, talking or dictating, as it happens in in other cases. So going back to that moment, I mean, I think Tim always kind of has the idea in his mind before it becomes a fashion story. And this idea, I mean, as you can see here, for this project, The Mermaid, it came from reading again a book. But many other of his ideas comes from anywhere, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
they come from everywhere. I mean, it could be a film that you've seen. It could be something someone's just said on stage today. I mean, it's what Abel said right at the beginning, was that when you first look at a film, it's the first image that comes up that's the most important. Was very interesting to me. I was thinking about that. And then the other thing, actually, that Peter Beard said when he first sat down that I found so touching was the first thing he said is that I'm an escapist. And I thought, that's a photographer who I was looking at when I was at school, and he was a photographer who I perceived as a documentary photographer who was opening up a window, an incredibly exotic window for me as an 18-year-old wannabe photographer from England. And I'd never seen anything like he'd photographed. So for him to come on stage today and describe himself as an escapist, somehow I was like, God, that's an incredible way to describe yourself. It's so brilliant, because you are an escapist, because your photographs help me to escape my life, where I came from, so I'd like to thank Peter Beard for helping me to escape as a schoolboy, my boring school life, and go to see a window into Africa that I'd never seen before. So, I think escapism, that word, is fundamental to me. And I think escapism relates to dreams, and I think that all the ideas I come up with, they're just daydreams and a form of escapism for me to escape reality, and yeah, it's an escape.
Well, he's not such an escapist when it comes to actually producing what he has in mind, because he has very specific ideas, requirements, and he works on a very tight schedule. I mean, every shoot that we have done together, and I know this also from other editors at other magazines, are, you know, very detailed. I mean, starting from the casting. I mean, team has to work with the right person. That's like the first ingredient. He needs his team, but the model.
Oh, Kristen, yeah. I mean,
It's really like a big part of, and I said mother, but you know, we did some magical story with Tilda Swinton and other.
Yeah.
Even like he was able to take even Marion Cotillard for one of our cover story, and Marion is not an easy person to deal with. She's a professional actress, so she would not be really happy to perform for a photographer.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think.
So he was able to make her be what a very dark princess in a kind of rose garden where something went wrong, and all the men became teen soldiers, if I remember well. But
what went wrong is it rained. That was the big problem. We were in a beautiful rose garden on the outskirts of Paris, and there I am dreaming about a fantasy of a tin soldier dressed in rubber and Marion Cotillard, and I'd seen her film La Vie en Rose, and I was so impressed by her and intimidated by her, and I thought, how am I going to capture your talent and your talent of performance? And the day started out with beautiful blue sky with nice fluffy white clouds, and there were roses everywhere. And then a thunderstorm came in, and 20 minutes later it was torrential rain. And
she was suddenly dressed in like black latex.
Yeah. And
if I remember well.
We were all sheltering under a little tent, and the magic had gone. And I think that's talking about dreams and escapism and fantasy. All of you in the audience, you only ever get to see everyone that's performing here on stage today and tomorrow. You only ever get to see the finished thing. And I think the reality, the determination anyone has to have to realize something is sometimes it really does all go wrong. Well, for a photographer, it is the weather.
Well, because also team is still like, in that sense, a very traditional, I think, photographer. I mean, not that there is no retouching or that there is no digital, don't get me wrong. I mean, that's part of being a human being today. So somehow it's impossible to escape that. Yeah. But still, I think a lot of the work that is in Tim's pictures is in camera. It means that he puts it together. When you see, I don't know, a giant airplane crashing in a small room, like in a famous portfolio that he did, or you see a balloon getting into a house, or you see like sand in an apartment in Paris, it's really there.
It has to happen. I think it has to happen because we live in such an incredible advancement in technology right now with digital photography, but I believe something's been lost along the way, and I think it's worth just talking about this for a minute. I think that we respond so well as performers, as people who view images and films, to something that actually happened. And I think I've talked about this at great length, about the importance of it happening. So of course we could have digitally put on the tail onto Kristen, and she didn't necessarily need to get into water that was actually quite cold. We could have digitally put that in front of her, but she needed that to lean against it, and I think she needed the tail that she's wearing was actually incredibly uncomfortable because the actual flipper bit was, I think, made of a very hard plastic, so that it actually cut into this bit of her leg. And it was the pain of that we would never have felt if we'd done it digitally, and it was that pain that she felt having to wear that incredibly tight and uncomfortable tail, wear clothes, and hold her breath, that gave her something to lean against and give her an exquisite performance that actually, in a roundabout way, was very reflective of Hans Christian Andersen's Little Mermaid. I mean, she went through terrible pain to realize her dream. So,
yeah, I mean, I think what the team is talking about is actually something that I keep coming back in terms of like what digital technology is doing to photography, is doing to magazine, is doing to our communication. I mean, if we look at the large picture that I think is important, it's really something that should enhance it, that but still make that experience happen. It cannot substitute a good picture, a good digital sexual conversation is not like good sex. Let's put it like that. Or like I would say, or a digital encounter of like where you make somebody fly. It's not like flying, and the expression of the people and the feeling of the people. It's not the same thing. I think it's important to always understand that digital and all the digital experience is something that has to enhance something that is good already. It's like there is no digital magazine that a digital magazine is not better than a magazine on paper because it's digital. It's better if it has a better content. So it's all about the content that in the case of team is all about the emotions. So those emotions has to be true.
I mean, the other thing to point out is very important. I'm so not anti-digital and technology because I think what certain people is, I think as long as you put passion into it, so whatever you put passion and love and a genuine, you really want to go somewhere with it genuinely, of course you can realize great things digitally. But for me, I love feeling the real thing, and I love seeing it happen in front of me. And most of the performers that I've worked with, whether they're actresses or models, they find the green screen way of acting very difficult. Whereas if there is something to react to in reality, however cumbersome it is, it does provide the magic, because the magic comes from not knowing what those cumbersome or difficult objects or weather or rain or all the things that happen in life, that's what creates the magic.
Let's go back for a minute to the casting. I mean, I can tell you that already the setting and deciding where things are going to happen and how, and bringing in like that big, water things in by these like ruined like British mansion was not an easy task, the same way of bringing an airplane in a room and things like that. But the cast, I think you have a very specific taste in women and the people you want to work with. One of them is Tilda Swinton. We have done 3-4 stories
This is
together.
the third. We've just shot the third with her.
How do you cast your characters?
I think I first started out as a photographer using models that no one had ever heard of, and I was sort of very adamant that big famous supermodels, I didn't really understand the point of it. Although I'd come from assisting photographers and I could see their brilliance as an assistant. But I was in a way rebelling against that whole supermodel thing, and I just thought, well, let's just work with kids that I think look great. And I suppose after 7 years I realized that there are certain people that can perform for the camera, moving or still, that have a sense of every bend in their body, and they somehow have the ability, it's kind of difficult to describe, they belong in the picture. That's the only way I can describe it. They belong in the film, they belong in the character, and they don't even know how they do it themselves, because I've spoken to them a lot about it. So when you create a mood, and just to talk about Kristen here, because you've just been looking at it, she does just become it, and you believe her. Everything about her performance as a mermaid, or whoever you want her to be, she becomes. And you look through the camera, you look through your viewfinder, and you look at the scenario that in your head you're telling yourself you've only just seen, you've just by chance come across it. You don't want to tell yourself that you've been working on it for a month, because it has to look effortless. And they have an ability to disappear into the photograph. And I think that is is something, just an incredible thing. And they tend to be people that are very seasoned and they've worked a lot. So yeah, like someone like Tilda, she's a famous performer, and she totally has the ability to disappear into the world you're looking at through the tiny window and belong in it, and you believe her. I think it's something to do with belief, and I think people become a character not by anything but 100 total % belief in it, and that's how they do it. And they're the people I'm always looking to photograph. So if you know anyone like that, let me know.
Can you tell us a little bit about that story that you did in Mexico? Again, like how that started. That was with Tilda. Team took like a Fitzcarraldo character, I think, took like his team on a trip in a very remote location in the north of Mexico, far from everything, where he kept them for 1 week. Tilda was part of the team, and they kind of recreated a kind of a magical kingdom there.
I think it was the magical kingdom had already been begun by a man called Edward James, who's a benefactor to the Surrealists, and he created a fantasy. He was an escapist, and he created a fantasy in the jungle in Mexico that was a sort of surrealist dream, a series of buildings with staircases that don't go anywhere and bedrooms, and it was just the whole fantasy of nothing more than living in the jungle, in the open air. And the buildings exist and they're protected, and I was showing them, and we concocted a story based on Edward James and the painters, the artists that he invited to work in the jungle, and they're all characters in themselves, and they all had their own fantasies and their own dreams, and that was our starting point. A group of artists in the jungle who created impossible fantasies.
Yes, and there were, Cocteau and Dali and all these...
Magritte,
all these people that
Leonora
visited him.
Carrington, she was another creator of fantastical, dark, sinister worlds that are just totally their own private worlds that are their own. And I think that's also fascinating.
Now, what the beauty of this somehow is that that portfolio, I mean, brought us a lot of honors, but from people do you less expect, like the American Association of Magazines, it's really like a lot of guys, they like stories about politics, about sports. I think certain images, and as Abel Ferrara said, has the capacity to communicate because they are dealing with emotions, and that story was dealing a lot with emotions. Like most of our team's pictures, it's never just like an image, and all the things that we see in the pictures kind of disappear in the emotion that you get from the images. I mean, sure, we had a lot of hair and makeup. I mean, her stylist and makeup artist, and we had, like clothes made for these, like there are like, sets, and there are a lot, but all of that becomes just, I would say, part of the background, and even like the performance of the model or actors kind of part of the background, and really what you deal with are the emotions that you get from that. That is, I think, where we started this morning with Ferrara, when he was talking like, his movie is really about like the emotion that you get out of it. It's like that's kind of the dialogue. How, Tim, do you sustain this kind of production, because each one of these jobs somehow, between the time you dream it and the time we make it happen, are some months, and it's quite expensive to produce this kind of stories. How do you what is your work routine? How do you balance commercial work with editorial work with personal work?
I think some of the bigger productions are incredibly draining, because a lot of you are filmmakers and photographers yourselves, and you know how draining it can be. And I came to the realization that in my head, the hoop I was trying to jump through was always a bigger production, something more complicated, more people, more. And I thought, well, I have to do the exact opposite of that and actually strip everything away and forget any prop, any mise en scène, any environment, any beautiful light. I have to just go back and get rid of it all and just look at a white background. So the reaction to sustaining what you're talking about is actually to go the reverse way and just to empty it out. And just so the portraiture that I've been doing now for sort of 3 or 4 years, I'm still trying to master. It's incredibly hard to take a meaningful portrait of someone against a white background. And that's something that is, at the moment, I'd say, what I'm really focusing on. Just in photography, the idea of just the portrait. Of course, you get sort of sidetracked into to falling back on sets and props and light and so on. But it's really going absolutely anti that and going against a white background. I think that's where I'm at now. And then, of course, film. So, you know, just working in film, which is a completely different way of working, because I think in photography, you all as an audience, you'll look at an image, a still image, and you read so much into it that perhaps the photographer didn't even put there, or I don't know whether Peter Beard knows how much his pictures, how I've read them. It's probably completely not how he took them. And I think that's very interesting, that as a photographer you suggest a mood and you push the audience at it, and it has its own life and impact. And then I think with film, you're really just pulling the audience through all the way with the dialogue and the characters, and you're just leading them through all the way. So that's a totally new adventure for me to go into, to working on film, and I hope that I'm fortunate enough to carry on, because I really absolutely loved working on that film. It was just a very easy process the way it all came about. So, and to work with an actor like Ben Whishaw, he gave so much and opened up, and I could just see what one can achieve with performance. That, I mean, just imagining being a photographer and just working for so long on still and seeing the beauty of movement, particularly wind. When you look at someone and the wind blows through their hair or their clothes, it's something about wind is so beautiful. And you think, why am I freezing it all the time? And yes, there is a sense of power to freezing that, but for me right now, it's the movement and looking at that wind and hearing someone talk, and then being very careful about selecting sound to go with that moving image is something. Yeah, it's spectacular. It's riveting, actually.
Do you think that photography, especially like now, with like the big, I would say, competition that you have in terms of like the images that we continuously have and how they're mostly moving images, so you feel like the still can still survive and have its own?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you just look at, God, there's so many photographers who were taking pictures 100 years ago that are way more powerful than a picture that anyone might take tomorrow. There's a power, definitely there's a power, and I think it's an emotional power to a still image, particularly black and white for some reason. I don't know why, maybe people will know why. There's something about a black and white still image that I think's incredibly poignant and powerful. And I think the simplicity of a black and white portrait, that's a photographer has been sensitive enough to capture a very tender moment, a very tender gesture that someone gives that photographer is forever valuable. So I don't think that photography as a still is ever going to be threatened by anything. I think it's...
I mean, actually, I never asked you, how did you decide to become a photographer? I mean, what was like your encounter? I mean, sure, you just said something about escaping.
Yeah, I think it was photography for me. I just felt verbally fluent visually. I could just talk, and in a way, I loved reading, and I tried to write, but it just constructing sentences about what I could see in my head felt so laboured and full of so much effort. I felt that images, cartoons, doodles, it somehow was a language that I felt very comfortable with. And yeah, I think it was just immediately something, and just by being a photographer, being fortunate enough to be able to indulge myself in that form of communication has actually educated me, really, to be able to sit here now and talk to all of you. It's somehow been an immense education for me to be able to concentrate.
Who were your kind of inspirations growing up in photography? I mean, usually you were an assistant to Mr. Penn.
To Avedon.
Avedon.
Yeah, everyone confuses the two. Penn and Avedon. I think it's the era. I think I actually am ashamed to say I didn't know so much about Avedon that I do know now. So going back to what I just said, photography has been an immense education for me. I mean, I knew the obvious, the greatest hits of Avedon, but I didn't know the depth in his writing and his intelligence. But I think I started out, I definitely wasn't fashion photography that I gravitated towards. I started out, I think the first book I pulled off the library shelf in the photography section was Diane Arbus' book, the one with the two twins on the cover. Sure. I forget what it's called, but it's got the most amazing introduction to photography I think I've ever read. And yeah, people like Peter Beard, who you're also fortunate enough to be able to have sitting here. It's such a humbling experience for me to follow a photographer of such magnitude. I think, yeah, Irving Penn was someone that I looked at who seemed to me to photograph the gesture of the woman with so much grace and dignity. He photographed, yeah, the gesture of the woman with great beauty that I hadn't seen before. And then Penn led to Avedon, and then so on and so on and so on and so on. I could just go on mentioning loads of photographers.
Do you feel like somehow your job is more difficult than what was their job? Somehow, just talking about that kind of competition,
yeah,
of you know, the assault of images that we live every day. I mean, it is like a world of images. I mean, I think there was like a much more selected kind of group of images that would reach us and stay with us. Now, everything is communicated through images.
I sort of very envious when I look at the work of someone like Cecil Beaton, or because they were the pioneers of photography. They were the ones that were sort of setting what it was to become. I mean, Richard Avedon, when he first started taking fashion photography, it was such a new industry, and he was really setting a series of rules, if you like, that perpetuate today. So I think in a way that the ones that were pioneering, the first fashion photographers, the ones that set the rules in a way, not that there need to be rules, but there kind of are rules. Yeah, I'm sort of envious that they had that time and that they had those exquisite clothes. And when I look at Irving Penn's pictures of his wife Lisa in Balenciaga, I just think, my God, I would have died to have taken those pictures of that woman in those exquisite clothes. But that's a sort of a stupid thought as well, because it's so nostalgic, and that's harking back to what's been is better than what's now, which of course is absolutely not true. Where we exist now, there's some genius designers who make brilliant clothes that are living, and there's genius hair and makeup and models, and just as fortunate. I think you just have to just goes back to what I was saying to someone earlier today. Just be curious and just be open and not get stuck on the fact that Irving Penn did take the most beautiful picture of Lisa Fontgris. It was actually, there's just as much beauty as there was then around today. I really do believe that.
Let me ask you something, because this is something Mr. Avedon was always a little bit ashamed of, taking fashion pictures. Did you ever feel like that fashion photography was not photography somehow? That, you know, I mean, basically having to decide between, you know, like be reborn as Salgado or as Tim Walker. Are you happy to be Tim Walker?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, because I think as a you know, young I didn't come from a fashion photography. I was coming from a photography and film background, and I kind of fell into fashion because I was fortunate enough to find that it allowed me to realize the fantasy. And I'm very happy and feel very fortunate to be able to do what I do. I feel incredibly fortunate, actually.
I know this was a little bit of a rhetorical question
No,
somehow,
but it's a good one.
because
It's a good one because I think actually what you're saying is, do photographers, and I'm sure there are a lot of photographers in the audience who don't know anything about fashion, and they follow the more traditional documentary aspect of photography. And I think that I think I look at Avedon's pictures of fashion, and they're just as
much better than his,
maybe
reportage pictures.
I mean, they're
How
they're
it's
equal.
social, like
If you look at
yeah,
if you look at in the American West, a book that I'm sure a lot of you
Sure.
know, brilliant portraiture of all sorts of people, and then you look at a picture of Jean Shrimpton jumping in the studio with an incredible dress that was very reflective of the mood of the times. They're just as valuable. Each one has its own value, and it's. I don't know whether Avedon was
ashamed of his
ashamed.
fashion.
I think maybe all photographers go for an awkwardness because it's such a. You
I
feel
mean,
silly.
even like, I don't know what you think about that. Just the Bailey show at the British Portrait
Yeah.
Gallery. Again, David Bailey edited that show, and
Yeah.
he really put it up the way he wanted.
Yeah.
And clearly, he feels very bad about his fashion because the fashion part is relegated to very few rooms, and there are a lot of pictures of reportage in Africa to feel like he cares. That we do know, but you don't need to show it at the National Portrait Gallery. They're not really your best pictures somehow.
I think it's very hard for a photographer, actually, any creative person.
Edit him.
And
Yeah.
again, all of you in the audience will know what I mean. So you can't see it. You can't see what your strengths are, and you can't see what your weaknesses are. And I bring it back to me. I often fall into the trap of being in love with my weaknesses. And then people point out my strengths, and I think they're my weaknesses. So it gets very confusing to recognize. And Bailey, his strength is his portraiture and his moment. And again, no one recognizes their moment because, of course, you don't, because time goes by. And Bailey had this fantastic moment, and I went to the show, and I really recommend seeing it if it's still on. I think it is just on in London. His moment for me, and everyone would have a different opinion about what his moment was, but it was when he did the box of pin-ups, I think it's called.
Yeah.
And it was just a moment in time where people came in front of his camera that somehow you couldn't capture, and wasn't alive at the time, you couldn't capture the 60s of London, or how I perceive it to be, the mood, the smell, the hair lacquer, the dust, the clothes, the way they felt, than that box of pin-ups. And the picture he did of Mick Jagger with the hood up and the rabbit fur mod thing going like that into the camera is a photographer who's just caught that day and that era and put it in aspect.
Totally.
It's
Totally.
incredible. And I don't think he would even have known when he took that picture that picture was going to become a frozen window onto 1960, whatever it is.
And the fashion of 1960
Yeah,
in a certain way. I mean,
yeah.
when I was talking about fashion, and for many years, I felt a little bit ashamed of working in fashion. And I talked with many people, Miuccia Prada being one of them, and we felt together very ashamed to be working in fashion instead of doing something more useful. But at the end, actually, I think fashion is this very incredibly strong force of change in society, and maybe thanks to all the success of fashion in the last decades, I think fashion can bring more change to society and be a very strong force of change, especially when it comes to issues of race and gender. I think it's really like something that can break boundaries, because fashion photography exactly crosses all the line, crosses all the national borders. Doesn't matter if you are in Russia or if you are in China, if you live under a repressive government, you still are going to look at some maybe even advertising campaign where, you know, there are two women kissing or two men embracing, and that's like the message that fashion can spread out.
It should definitely do that, and I think it goes back again to what Peter Beard said when he first said about escapism, and I think we mustn't forget that the value of escapism to all of us is so fundamental, and I really would stand up in front of all of you today and say, I really believe in escapism, and I believe in entertainment, and I believe how important it is to entertain people. And I wish I had more pictures to show you and try and entertain you more, but or more film, but I don't.
Sirs, I have to interrupt.
Yeah.
I'm very sorry. It's been a great conversation, but we are out of time. We only have time for just one question.
Oh, tricky. Oh.
Who is the lucky one?
Who's going to ask?
And where is the question? Here, please.
Hi.
Hello.
It is nice to meet you in here because last 2 years ago, I don't know your name. And on my birthday, my wife, she's with me. And then she bought your fantastic book on my birthday. This one, yeah.
That's
exactly.
fantastic to know.
And afterwards, I entered your fascinating worlds with this photo. And Mr. Signor Tonchi asked a lot of fashion acts and like this question, but I want to ask to you, your family, your nanny, because I bought another gift from my wife with Grand Nanny's photographs books.
Yes.
With the British older women as well.
Yeah.
And then I saw fantastic lives in the British women on them. And then how affected your life, your family, particularly your nanny?
Well,
would you describe a little bit for us?
Yeah.
If it's not your special.
It's kind of a very sweet question, and thank you for being so sweet. How would I describe my granny? I mean, I've had an obsession with age. I'm obsessed with all age of human beings. I always have done. All photographers do. And I think I've been photographing the same age group, a young woman of a certain age, for a long time in fashion, and I just wanted to do, again, jump through a hoop and do something a bit different. So I decided to do a book on another love of my life, which is the grandmother. And I am fortunate enough to have come from a very loving and strong family, and I have an older brother, and I have a mother, and I had a father, and I had two very sweet set of grandparents. And I think my family... Oh, is that all right with the music? Can you still hear me? I think maybe that's a warning. Got to get off. Anyway, I'll be really quick. I loved my granny, and I loved my family, and yeah, I have been very fortunate to come from a very loving family, and I think that's the love of family can give enabled me to have the confidence to sit here and tell you some stories. So that's a good way to end. Shall we end there?
Thank you. Team Walker, Stefano Tonchi, thank you very much.